we have Amanda Mace. Please make her welcome. We might want that up a little bit higher. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, right for me.
Yeah. Perfect. Okay. I don't know how to follow that. How fabulous was that talk? I don't know how to follow it, but I will try. I'm going to talk really about the gap that probably a lot of us felt were there, but we couldn't prove it, and I've got some evidence today. So our goal in all of this was last year, and certainly the Perth community, but many of you would know that WebKey distributed some surveys, both organizational and user surveys. And what we were looking for really was to gather some evidence to stuff that we felt we already knew, was that there was a difference, potentially, between what organizations thought they were doing in accessibility and what the user was actually experiencing, and then kind of to get some comparative data. So we knew at the time that there wasn't any recent data where we had users and organizations at the same time where we could compare that data, and we wanted that. We wanted to know if organizations felt they were doing a good job. And from a survey basis, being able to say it in a survey rather than publicly, because we all know you get up here and you say all the good things, but what did they really feel? Did they think they were really doing a good job at accessibility? And did the users agree with that? So what was their actual experience? We really wanted to get some sort of idea. We found that, I won't tell you, spoiler alert, there's a gap. But we got sort of a little, while we're putting together the questions, we went, well, there's some more we want to know. Like, what are the biggest issues facing users still? What are the biggest issues facing organizations? What do they still have concerns about? So we were actually able to get all of that, and a little bit more, to be honest, more than I thought we would. But today I'm going to talk about that perception organizations have of themselves, and then the reality of the user experience, according to this survey. So I'll get into the responses. These slides are showing, the following slides are going to show the responses of the organizations on how accessible they believe their product is. And we will talk about WCAG, we talk about perceived compliance as well as actual compliance, just how well they think they're doing. So the great news is, and I'm a really positive person, so let's start with the great news. More than 90%, 91.5 I think it was, believed that accessibility was important for their organization. Now, there is a small caveat to this, is that we put them out there. We had a really great response, both from organizations and from the users, but the message was being spread by people who were already in accessibility, or at least had a mind for it. So there's a small caveat to this wonderful result, is that people who were spreading it were already fighting the good fight within their organization. So I do want to put that out there, but that's a really fantastic and exciting result. We should be excited about that. People are thinking and talking about digital accessibility. They think it's important. So 71% of the organizations that responded had undertaken some sort of evaluation for accessibility, and almost half of those, so 46%, believed, had actually done their in-house testing rather than external testing. Now, there's a couple of different views of this. One is, great, people are doing in-house testing, but the other is that idea of checking your own homework. My kids think that's a great idea, but it's not actually ideal. We very much want to use the carrot rather than the stick, but I want to put it out there. This is exactly what GNC in America got in trouble for. So for those of you who are aware, Gomez versus GNC is the lawsuit I'm talking about. Basically what happened was GNC got up and said, we're accessible because we used Wave, and it said no errors. And the judge determined that GNC did not have the expertise to read the Wave report, let alone declare their website accessible, and they lost that lawsuit. Gomez won. So while we don't have that sort of litigious environment here in Australia, it's probably important to note that in America, they've really solidified the need for accessibility experts, for our expertise as professionals. And I think it's a bit of a win in our corner to say, you need to know what you're talking about. You can't just say you understand it. You need to know what you talk about. And maybe that goes a bit to our broader conversation when we talk about the future of OZeWAI and recognizing professionals in this field. Despite the fact that we typically design mobile first, everyone has a mobile first approach, more than half, or less than half, or just under half, are not testing for mobile accessibility at all, full stop. And I actually found that quite surprising, because certainly from a QA testing point of view, this is something we are doing. And it's not happening from an accessibility point of view. And it may go a bit to Gion's point yesterday, is that there's not a set of guidelines that people are really following. They're trying to adapt WCAG to it. So we asked people to kind of break down what sort of testing they had done, and it was a really pleasant surprise to see that more than 50% were testing not just compliance, not just the checklist. They were using people with disabilities to do usability testing. 17% said that they had tested for technical compliance only, and only 5% said that they were, of that sort of breakdown, were using just the user testers. It's not a large majority, but I think that this is a really good sign. 53% are using compliance and user testing by people with disabilities. And I think that we probably, as accessibility professionals, owe a bit of a thank you to UXers for this one, because they have been driving the user-centric approach. So when we're, as part of our journey with clients and various customers, look to your UX people, because they are user-centric, and that's really what we are. So I just want to give a bit of a shout out to the UX designers who've really helped, certainly me in my journey, to get people describing what we're after, what we're doing this for. We also asked if, after testing, they had done any remediation and retesting. So a large majority are, 77%. That's actually not what I want. I want 100%. If you do testing, nothing is more frustrating for those of you in the room who do testing and compliance auditing. Nothing is more frustrating than handing over a report and nothing ever gets done with it. That's a very frustrating feeling. So 77%, while very good, I really want 100%. You remediate after you get your results, you fix it, and then you retest. Only 9.5 carried any sort of certification. Now, if we think back a few slides, you might remember that I said 71% have had their websites tested for accessibility, but only 9.5 stated that they carried any level of certification. There are two interesting points from this. One is that's actually a really low number, and I think that's something we need to consider as someone who works in the Accessibility Guidelines Working Group, that this is such a low number of certification claiming compliance. But the secondly is that we had some follow-up questions to this, which I didn't make slides for, but I think are important to this. We questioned the importance of compliance within the survey, and 50%, and even 50%, believed that compliance was necessary. 33% thought it was either a good investment, and then the rest all believed it was useful. No one thought that compliance wasn't useful or important. So it's really interesting that what we have is certification at a less than 10%. I just think those are interesting points. I haven't really drawn any conclusions on these, to be honest. I just think they're interesting points. Now, a majority, so despite my last slide, a majority felt their website was accessible. In fact, 57% felt that their website was accessible. 45% felt that they met WCAG, either 2.0 or 2.1. So how does that work, right? I just said that 9.5 said they had certification. So what we have now is a perceived idea of compliance. They believe they are meeting the standard. Maybe it's a good time to remind everyone that WCAG is, it's not a BuzzFeed quiz. It is an international standard, and there are ways to go about testing for it. It's interesting. I think the next slide is even more interesting. So, once it'll move, there we go. 21% believe that they're meeting WCAG 2.0 to level AA, which is what we aim for here in Australia, according to the advisory, the advice from the Human Rights Commission. 24%, and this does not reflect my experience in the industry, I have to admit. 24% believe that they were meeting WCAG 2.1 to level AA, and I have even better news. 2% believe they were meeting WCAG 2.1 to level AAA. The ones that are laughing are from accessibility firms. This low percentage brings up some very interesting questions about the attitude towards WCAG compliance, both perceived and actual. So these are perceived compliance numbers. And I just think we have to ask ourselves as an industry how this is happening. Both the fact that they're low percentages, but then that people believe they're meeting this without testing for it on any sort of official basis. So as an industry, we have some questions to ask. There were some really positive results around incorporating digital accessibility as a standard operating procedure. So with a very small exception of only 7% where they said it wasn't defined or not even in consideration, there was a sub-question around this, around having a digital accessibility maturity model, which is quite popular in America in particular. Level Access came up with a model that I think most people probably use to rate sort of the maturity of an organization, where they are in their accessible journey. And only 14% said they were using one. Now, this had a global responses survey. I suspect, although I can't say, I suspect the ones who did have a maturity model were probably American respondents, because we just don't see it very often here. Another important part of this research was to ask what the organization's biggest issues still were. And the answers were really varied. We actually gave them far more than just these options, but these were the ones that were really popular. We let them tick as many as they needed. Accessibility training. And the interesting thing about the accessibility training, which at 19% was a pretty good result, 67% in an earlier sub-question of this had actually said that they have ongoing accessibility training for staff already happening. So it's really interesting. They want more training, which is great news for people like us and Intopia and Vision Australia. They want more training. So that's really good news for us. We had resources to test and fix issues, internal support, not surprising that that had a lot of responses. Needing information on requirements and compliance actually scored really low here. So there seems to be just a lack of priority given to the actual standards and what we need to do to meet them. So it would seem from the responses that we had from the organizations that they understand digital accessibility is important. Most respondents felt that their website was accessible. And now I want to tell you what the user experience was like. I feel like you know where this is going. So I'll start by saying that the survey was open to any individual, whether they had a disability or not. It had a global response, and I've listed some of the countries here that we got responses from, which was really exciting. So there's some pretty cool ones in there. Spain, Kuwait, Germany, France, Denmark. About 40% of the individual responses came from Australia, so you can tell it really was a global response. With all of the really good data that we got, and for this particular, for the user survey, we had almost 100 people complete this survey. It's great data. Around the world, over 80% of the users who replied to this survey said that the accessibility laws in their country were not sufficient. Right, so we had that conversation yesterday with Andrew around accessibility laws here in Australia. This is a problem worldwide. People think it's not good enough. Well, 55% of the respondents to the survey identified as having a disability. 8% of those did not associate with any sort of disability support group. This is actually an important note for me as someone who does a lot of consulting, because I have had it said to me that people with disability have help training to know how to use and make things like settings on their operating systems easier for them to use. Aside from that being a very bold and big assumption, here we have evidence that not everyone's actually tapping into resources that are available. And that's assuming that all of these support groups actually have this information in the first place. As a part of understanding the broader scale of barriers, we also asked what other issues, aside from disability, affected people interacting with digital materials. Now, some said they had age-related issues. So an example of this would be, my lovely mother-in-law, who is fairly tech-savvy, but as she's gotten older, has a bit of a shake to her hand. And so she really struggles to use the trackpad and the mouse and prefers to use the keyboard. And in fact, the day I taught her how to tab to input fields was, you should have seen it. She was like, oh, wow. It was very exciting for her. So we know that people are being affected as they get older with how they engage with digital products. And this is actually, it's a really important note because for this generation right now, who's up and coming, people my age, we're not going to want to give up technology in 30 years from now, are we? We've been brought up with this. It's got a special challenge for my mother-in-law who wasn't brought up with the type of technology that we have today. She's got to learn it. Now, I'm going to have to give it up if we don't make this accessible. So it's really important that we look at those sort of issues and deal with them. Financial limitations topped the list of barriers, other barriers aside from disability. The Disability Pay Gap Equal and Human Rights Commission research report, which was done by Simonetta Lungi, backs this up, where it found that there was approximately a 14% difference in the disability pay gap. So this really does exist, and it's particularly a hardship for people with disabilities. There were also responses around difficulty with access to technical support, advice, and just a lack of computer skills. So none of these are going to be a surprise to any in the room. The biggest issues facing users. Respondents were able to take as many issues as they felt were applicable to them, and the main issues were poor design. Anyone else relate to that? Yeah? Yeah, okay. CAPTCHA. How about this one? What did I say yesterday? Does the poll count as part of the sign? I just want to know. We think, right? Yes? The other ones that came into effect were things like poorly designed forms. What about finding relevant information? There's a very famous story that Vivian tells when she was trying to change her address. Trying to change her address at her bank, and she couldn't find the form online. And when she called, they said, well, you're looking for the wrong name. You're looking for change of address. You should be looking for change of domicile. What was that about easy English? All right, so clearly not just the survey, but for people in this room, there are some real usability issues that are accessibility issues, and they affect us all. These are the ones, if you're with an accessibility firm, take out your phones and take pictures now, because this is important. 65% of people state that they have left a website because of its inaccessible design. That is actually a huge number. And it includes respondents who didn't identify as having a disability. All right, so it's fair to say if you owned a company, you would take some notice of that number. As accessibility professionals, we often find it hard to make a business case for accessibility, something tangible. This is tangible. All right, and it gets even more interesting. 59% of the people who had complained to the owner of the website about accessibility, of those, 42% who complained did not go back to check if the issue had been fixed. You've lost that user. They're gone, probably for good. Those who did go back to check, anyone want to have a guess at how many actually found it was resolved? Oh. Gee, it's not that bad. 12% had found the issue had been resolved. So you can understand why people aren't going back. Why would you bother? When we asked users, does a website's design, accessibility affect your impression of the organization? Right here in purple and red, because I like those colors, it says 95% said yes. That's a really big number. What a powerful statement that is. So I have all of these numbers, and I guess the question is, what do they mean? And the perception really from the organizations is that we get it, and we're doing it well enough. And the expectation is, and fair enough, if you get it, you should be doing it well, full stop. And the reality is that there's a gap here. There's a problem. We are not as good as we think we are doing, and we need to do better, and we can do better. And once we understand what the users need, that's really all we have. So that's it for me. I'm around for the rest of the day. Lots of you know me. Find me on Twitter. Find me on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook. I'm everywhere. Find me, talk to me. There are more results. I couldn't fit everything into 20 minutes. They were actually fairly big surveys, but come and chat to me about them. They were fascinating and really shed some light on what we're doing as a whole in our community.